blues or something.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. It's 6 o'clock. Just want to welcome everyone. I'm Deacon John from St. John's Episcopal Church. Want to welcome everyone who's on Zoom with us tonight, as well as those who are tuning in with us on Facebook, and those who will be watching this later because this is being recorded and will be put on our YouTube channel. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jesse, one of our esteemed members of our congregation and also a professional tour guide. And he's going to give us a great session today. I just want to remind you, for those of you on Zoom, just remember to keep your mics muted. We'll have a Q&A at the end. He has a lot of turf to cover tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse.
Good evening. Thought that was maybe a version of We Shall Overcome. It wasn't me. Good evening. Within the next hour or so, I will just be trying to pique your interest in some of the often overlooked individuals and events that have led to today's African American communities in Northern California. And I'll try to keep the presentation. I haven't timed it, but I'll try to keep it under 90 minutes, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end. A little about my qualifications for speaking on this topic. I received a bachelor's degree in American Studies from Amherst College, Central Massachusetts. Then I spent a year at Yale in their PhD program. And in order to avoid being drafted into the Vietnam War, I took a job teaching high school in inner city St. Louis. Turned out to be my favorite job ever. But I left after 4 years, having been admitted to Berkeley's PhD program. While there, I did some groundbreaking research on Mary Ellen Pleasant, an irascible, eccentric, fearless, and colorful Black pioneer. And I'll talk quite a bit about her later. I fell into a job with the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library, and where I was introduced first to one or two, and eventually through their connections, I met 22 of the descendants of the Black community that was in San Francisco between the Gold Rush and the Second World War. That population was less than 2% of the population of the total population of San Francisco, but that's mostly their experiences and their milestones that I'll be talking about this evening. Let me go to the outline. I'm going to talk, where does the name California come from and what does that have to do with Black history? How did they talk about race in New Spain, which California was a part of before it became Mexico, before it became part of the United States? Gold Rush settlers. Alexander Lydesdorf, who's one of the founding fathers of San Francisco. Slavery, in fact, and in law in California before the Emancipation Proclamation. Blacks in Chinatown. 1850 Compromise, its implications for Black people living in California. Two women who were 100 years before Rosa Parks, 90 years maybe. What was the Rights of Testimony campaign and what were the colored conventions? Again, back to Mrs. Mary Ellen Pleasant. Buffalo soldiers at the Presidio. A Black girl came up with the nickname for one of the major events in San Francisco history called Jewel City. Some Black First, how Blacks were being represented in popular culture, and a little bit into the 20th century. Okay, she doesn't look Black, but she's a California girl. And growing up in the East, when people said California girl, this is what we imagined. She was always young, blonde, fit, and carefree. Didn't seem like she needed to worry about her income. And I want to introduce you to another California girl, Queen Calafia. She's sort of the original California girl. Who was she? She's actually a mythical figure. There was a very popular novel in 1510, less than 20 years after Columbus's first voyage to the New World. There was a novel published in Spain, and it was a story of an island on a remote part of the world that was governed by Black women, mujeres negras. And these women kept griffins as pets. Griffins are a mythical creature that's part lion, part eagle. And if men ever came to the island, they would be killed by the griffins and eaten. So a very kind of exciting story. But the question is, why Calafia? What was in that name? We think, scholars believe it refers to the caliphs of the Muslim world, the rulers of the Muslim world. There was a caliphate in Syria, the Umayyad Caliphate. There was a caliphate in Spain and Portugal. And at that time in history, Europeans were used to Black people as part of the Moorish invasion. The Moors were people who came out of North Africa. They were Berbers, who are very fair-skinned people who lived in North Africa since time immemorial. But they hired large numbers of Black men from what is now Mauritania and Senegal in West Africa as their soldiers and in other functions. So after over the 700 years that the Moors ruled Spain, many people were used to seeing Black people who were powerful, they thought wealthy, and so that's how you get Othello's, Shakespeare's Othello. That's how when you look at Renaissance paintings, you see the three kings, and one of them is a Black king and very well dressed. So Caliph, we believe, goes back to that Muslim civilization, which goes back to the reality of Moors in Europe. And that's how the name Calafia, who rules over California. So there's some history that's in the very name of our state. The picture on the screen is you go to the Mark Hopkins Hotel on the top of Nob Hill. Sometimes there's a private room, I've been to a wedding there, called the Room of the Dons, a name for the early Spanish leaders of California. And they have images of Queen Calafia and her Amazon warriors. Now in Spain, there was a lot of concern about race. And there was a whole genre of painting called castas. And there are dozens of these paintings. I'm sorry I couldn't get a larger image. But they show people of different races when they mix with, and then they have a child. What do you call that child? There were 16 different names for different ways in which whites from Europe, Blacks from Africa, and Native Americans, when they mixed, what you might call them. So the names we may recognize as mulatto, which usually meant one white parent and one Black parent. Mestizo, one Native American parent and one white parent. And then through the, there's a whole, as I said, a whole hierarchy. And the more mixed you were with non-white people, the lower your social status. So this is sort of a close-up of a couple of the images. These images are not historically accurate. We don't think that many of these women were, or these children were as well-fed and well-dressed as they may look in these images. But here's Pio Pico. Look at him closely. He was the last Mexican governor of Alta California, and those are his daughters. These were considered Mexicans, but I'm just pointing out that what we say Mexican, we're not talking about Castilian Spanish people. We're talking about a mixed race. And he acknowledged that he had African ancestry and other ancestries. And so this did not stand in his way of being an important person in the Mexican government, which would be different once the Americans came to power. Then race was determined in a different way. Okay. California, during the gold rush, which started, gold was discovered on the American River at Sutter's Mill in January of 1848. But the word about the gold didn't really get to the general population until May. And then within the next 4 years, about 300,000 people came to California in search of gold. So why do I have Oregon here? Oregon made a point of not allowing Black people to settle. And this was a state that up until 1920s, it was basically illegal for Black people to settle in Oregon. It wasn't just by accident. It wasn't because it was too cold or too far. It was that we were forbidden. And the law said that if such free Negro or mulatto should fail to quit the country, so you got 6 months, I guess, free, as required by this act, he or she may be arrested upon a warrant issued by some justice of the peace, and if guilty upon trial before such justice, shall receive upon his or her bare back not less than 20, no more than 39 stripes, to be inflicted by the constable of the proper county. So there weren't a great number of Black people coming to California during the gold rush. There were none going to Oregon, or very, very few. This is a picture of Black settlers. I'm not exactly sure where this picture is, but I believe it's near Calafia, which is the town where Sutter's Mill was located. When I went there years ago, there were still a few Black families living in the area who'd been there since gold rush times. Some Black people came to California, free people of their own will, and a significant number came as slaves with their masters who worked them in the mines for, of course, no pay, because that's what slavery represented in America. But I just wanted to show you that there were Black people settling, buying land, and a lot of the early Black settlers lost their land because California passed an early law that no non-white person could testify in court against a white person. So if a white person stole your land, you couldn't do anything about it. This is, I just want to comment, prior to the Republican Party in the United States, there was a party called Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men. And Fremont was one of the presidential candidates of that party. This party was not pro-Black. They were opposed to slavery being allowed or legal west of Kansas. There was a whole battle before the Civil War of where slavery would be allowed to go. And the Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men Party basically said, we don't want slaves. They will drive down the cost of labor. Rich people will come in with their slaves and take all the best land. There were a lot of other reasons. But they didn't often want Black people, free Black people, in those territories either. They wanted that land to be for Americans moving west and Europeans coming into the area. So that was the ancestor of the Lincoln's Republican Party. Anyway, this is Alexander Lydesdorf. Mr. Lydesdorf was a founding father, I say, of San Francisco. His father was a Danish sea captain. His mother was a light-skinned slave. They lived in Danish West Indies, today's U.S. Virgin Islands. His ancestry was Afro-Cuban, Danish, Carib, who are the native people of the Caribbean, and Jewish. And when he came to San Francisco by way of New Orleans, he was a leading citizen in early San Francisco. He was a wealthy landowner. He started the first public school in California. He brought the first steam-powered vessel into San Francisco Bay. Why don't we know more about him? Unfortunately, right as gold was being discovered in May 1848, he died of typhoid fever. So it's all that's really left of his legacy, because all his land was taken through various court challenges. His children really received next to nothing. He's buried here in the nave of the Mission Dolores in the Mission District of San Francisco. If you come into the front of the church, this image, you're looking toward the altar, but right where this picture is taken, you will look down and you will see the grave marker for Alexander Lydesdorf. He had one of the largest funerals in this, in early, well, they didn't call it San Francisco back then, they called it Yerba Buena. The name San Francisco would come, well, it came around the time of the gold rush. As people were coming into California, they changed the name, took the name of the San Francisco Bay and gave it to the town that was there. So that's where Lydesdorf is buried. And he's often mentioned in Black history as one of the pioneers. I've been to some presentations about him, and I think you have to introduce the question or the issue here of passing. When people are thought to be from one group when they're from another, and you can actively pass where you decide, as many thousands of mixed race Black people did back in the 1800s, early 1900s. I will just no longer identify as a Black person because that's going to make me legally questionable and bring a lot of problems that I don't need. And I think you could also passively, I would say, pass. In Lydesdorf's case, I don't think that he would have denied he was of mixed heritage, but I don't think in his day-to-day dealings, he had to deal with being perceived as Black, because I don't think people perceived him as Black. And so that's an issue in early, many of the older Black families told me that they had relatives who came up from Louisiana. They were Spanish, French, and African blood, and if they didn't look like African Americans, they frequently would pass to get better jobs, to uncomplicate their legal lives, to keep control over their finances, etc. So I think this was the case with Lydesdorf. Doesn't lessen his accomplishments, but it's a little iffy about claiming him as a Black pioneer. Okay. This is not the best picture, but this building still stands on the edge of Chinatown on Stockton Street. And if you go up that right-hand stairs, at least years ago when I did this, and you look to the left of the new door, there's stained glass window, because this used to be a Black Methodist church before, and they built this building around the church, or at least kept the window. And the reason this is in this presentation is because what little Black community there was lived right where we now, not in the middle, but on the edge of today's Chinatown. And there never was really in San Francisco, at least before the Second World War, any Black communities, any neighborhoods that were predominantly Black. So Black people were living in today's Chinatown. But San Francisco had a major issue with covenants on real estate. And this issue didn't even get resolved as late as the 1970s. I knew people who bought property in San Francisco, and there would be a paragraph saying that they could not legally sell this property to Mongoloids, Negroids, and they had some other category, which meant that the deed would be voided if you sold it to a non-white person. And of course, some of this was, today it's not an issue, but some of it was corrected by various fair housing laws. But it lasted in San Francisco for a very long time, which is why a lot of neighborhoods are not, don't have large minority populations. And then bringing us into the 20th century, the Black community that I met in my interviews and in my early days here really were disturbed by what was called urban renewal, and they called it Negro removal. And what is now the area around Japantown, at one time when the Japanese were forced into camps, that neighborhood was taken over by Black people. It's called the Fillmore. It was called the Harlem of the West. Everybody from Duke Ellington to Billie Holiday performed on that part of Fillmore. But after the war, there was a move across the country to get rid of old housing, to build new freeways, and the Black community experienced it as a destruction of whatever institutions and communities we had built, from which a lot of Black communities have not recovered to this day. Okay, 1850. Admission Day. California is admitted to the Union. But a lot of people don't realize there was a cost to this admission, because for every free state, and California was admitted as a free state, there had to be a slave state admitted soon around the same time. California, they broke that procedure, and by letting California come into the Union, this is only 2 years after the gold had been discovered, so it was a very quick transition from a Mexican territory to one of the United States. But Congress, what the South demanded in return, what people in those days called the slaveocracy, was a drastic fugitive slave law. We have fugitive slave laws going way back to George Washington's time, but this was the most stringent, and it basically deputized any white person in the North had to help the law enforcement capture Black people. And if the person did not have papers on their person saying I am free or I was born free, they were subject to being sold to the South. That was the whole movie, 12 Years a Slave. This was a terrifying prospect for Black people in the North or in any neighborhood where they felt that they had earned their freedom, that they could be captured and returned to, not to their old masters, to any person. So that was the compromise. You read about it in your history books, the 1850 compromise. The North got California, the South got the Fugitive Slave Law. And what did that mean? Many middle-class Black people in San Francisco moved to Victoria on Vancouver Island. A lot of people don't realize there was once a Black, there may be a remnant of a Black community there now, but they had to get out of the United States. As many as 50,000 Black people moved over into Ontario, Canada. And I've been to Ontario and I've been to some of those old communities. Most of those people moved back to the United States after the Civil War, but there's still, again, remnants of those early communities. This is all because of this fugitive slave law. It meant that you were never going to be safe. And so this was, again, a cost of California's admission to the Union. One of the consequences of this act was a young woman in Cincinnati, Ohio, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She and a few abolitionists were never more than a tiny percentage of the people in the North. But Louisa May Alcott's father, Harriet Beecher Stowe, These were people who were abolitionist families who believed in the destruction of slavery. They weren't sure how to destroy it, but they certainly were against its spread. So Harriet Beecher Stowe was, of course, motivated to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the most widely read book in the United States for the next 50 years, other than the Bible. This was a tremendously powerful work of literature. It came out in serialized, as books often did in those days. And during the war, of course, the famous story, President Lincoln welcomed her to the White House with the words, "So this is the little woman who started this big war." And of course, he was being partly humorous, because Lincoln was, but he was also acknowledging in some ways a fact, because what Uncle Tom's Cabin did was to humanize Black people. People began to feel for Eliza and Topsy, and they were afraid of Simon Legree, and it just became real to them that real people, not just people as they saw in magazines who might have written their life stories, but real people were involved in the slave system. And this is what motivated a lot of people to consider that slavery should come to an end in the South. Okay. Before Rosa Parks. Oh, I didn't have a picture, I'm sorry. There are two women who preceded Rosa Parks in challenging segregation on public transit. One of them was this woman, Mary Pleasant. I'll talk to her about her a little bit later. But let's just say one of the things that she did was to she challenged the North Beach and Mission Railroad. There were 8 cable car companies in San Francisco. They hadn't been taken over as municipal utilities yet. They were just private businesses. Just like the water company, believe it or not, was a private business. So Mary Ellen Pleasant set it up so that just the way we used to test housing discrimination by sending a white couple to an ad for an apartment and then sending a Black person to the same ad on the same day to see if there was discrimination. This was something that went on in the 50s, 60s, may still be going on. Mary Ellen Pleasant was trying to board this cable car line, and she had a white friend with her, and they allowed the white friend to get on. This was all strategized, and told her she could not get on. So she brought a lawsuit, and this was in 1865, I think, and she won. But 2 years before that, there was another Black woman named Charlotte Brown, and Charlotte did pretty much the same thing. She got on the omnibus rail line, cable car line, and she was, I'm sorry, I'm saying cable car, and I'm wrong, because cable car wasn't invented until 1863. These were rail lines, but they were pulled by horses. I'm sorry. Anyway, she got on and she said, the man said, the conductor refused to take her ticket, told her she needed to get off. And she said, "I ride this line every day. Why are you doing this?" And he and she went back and forth. This is according to the court testimony. And eventually, a white woman on the same car said, "I strenuously object to this negress," or whatever they called her, being on this car. And so he threw her in the street. And she brought a lawsuit, and she eventually won. And I love what the judge said in this case, because it feels, I don't know, it feels sadly poetic. The judge's name was Orville Pratt, and this is in the middle of our Civil War. And when he was ruling in Charlotte Brown's favor, he said, "It has already been quite too long tolerated by the dominant race to see with indifference the Negro or mulatto treated as a brute, insulted, wronged, enslaved, made to wear a yoke, to tremble before white men, to serve him as a tool, to hold property and life at his will, to surrender to him his intellect and conscience, and to seal his lips and belie his thought through dread of the white man's power. You could read that under a video of George Floyd. Personal comment. But I thought there were always people in America who stood up to racism, and people should not forget that. Rights of testimony. I'm going to get to Mary Ellen Pleasant here in a minute. Rights of testimony in the original California Constitution, Black people, Asian people, Mexican American people were not allowed to testify in court against any white person in any kind of dispute. And when you don't have this right, it is so consequential to your welfare. And in one case, a white man decided to shoot and kill a Black leader in his store in downtown San Francisco. The case went to trial. It seemed as if this man was going to be convicted until his lawyer questioned whether one of the witnesses was really white. And they actually had this man, and they looked at his hair and basically treated him almost like he was some kind of a horse. And they felt him up and decided that he was not 100% white. Therefore, his testimony was not valid, and the man got away with murder. This happened more than once in San Francisco. So the right to testify in court was an extremely important campaign. Mary Ellen Pleasant was very wealthy. I won't go into all the ways in which she earned her wealth. This is her in her later years. She was one of the people that helped finance the campaign to get Black people and others the right to testify in court. During the same period, Black people were holding conventions. Most of them were back east, where the majority Black population was, particularly in Philadelphia, but there were a couple of conventions in either Sacramento or Marysville that drew Black people from all over the state. And again, they were basically trying to fight for legal rights. Not so much social equality as we see it today, but just for the ability to not be stopped and having your life turned upside down on the whim of somebody else. Okay, Mary Ellen Pleasant. She was called the Queen Esther of her people by a Black journalist named Delilah Beasley. Delilah Beasley was kind of a remarkable woman on her own. She went around and interviewed a lot of the original Black settlers all over California and wrote this down. These were parts of the Oakland Tribune newspaper, and I think there have been books made from her notes. And for her to call Mary Ellen Pleasant the Queen Esther, you may remember that story from the Bible, I thought was about the highest compliment. It means that she was willing to put herself on the line for the freedom of her people. She was also called the mother of civil rights in California in a book by Sue Bailey Thurman. So that name may not ring a bell with a lot of people. Sue Bailey Thurman, I had the pleasure of meeting her again in her later years. She was the wife of Howard Thurman. That still may not ring a bell. Howard Thurman was Martin Luther King's mentor when they all lived in Boston. Martin Luther King went to Boston, BU. Sue Bailey Thurman and her husband were invited to go meet Gandhi in India. And while there, he talked with them about the whole concept of nonviolent, or what they call passive resistance. And so many people think that Howard Thurman, very well known in the Black community of his time, a minister, and at Howard University in Washington, he brought this concept back to Martin Luther King as a possible way to begin change in the South, in the Jim Crow laws and practices of the South. So when Sue Bailey Thurman wrote a book called Negro Pioneers of Early California, she called this woman the mother of civil rights. Um, well, who was she? Well, she was a woman who had, it's still, I did a lot of research on her, and I'm thinking I might need to write a book because most of what's out there about her is questionable. But she says she some kind of way escaped from slavery in Georgia when she was just a child. And she was taken to a Quaker community up in somewhere in Connecticut. And she married well. She was very, very smart, and she married well. And with the money that she helped people escaping to the north on the Underground Railroad. And when things got too hot for her, she decided to come to California. And when she came to California, she's most famous for running a boarding house that a lot of the influential men in San Francisco, San Francisco was 90% male during the gold rush. There were very few women. And most of the women who were there were in the, let's say, the entertainment business. So many of these men they didn't know how to cook, they didn't know how to sew, they didn't really know much about how to maintain themselves in a male world. So when they came into the city, they would stay at boarding houses where they would get good food and their clothes cleaned and haircuts and all that kind of thing. And Mary Ellen Pleasant ran one of these places. She was well known as that. She also possibly ran brothels. Anyway, she managed to invest very well and make quite a bit of money. And this is rather remarkable, given that she was acting as her own agent. Her husband was a sort of a mysterious maritime marine, I think, and so was almost never around. There are no pictures of him. So she was pretty much operating on her own. And when you read early histories of San Francisco, she is frequently given a full chapter in her own right. But I think that she also was involved in the Archie Lee case. This was a famous case of a black man born in Mississippi as a slave, brought to California, made to work for his master. And then when his master was ready to go back home, he decided he didn't want to go with him. He was in a free state, and he brought a lawsuit to sue for his freedom, the way Dred Scott had done. It's around the same time. And there were a lot of machinations in this case. And at one point he had to hide himself because the law enforcement was about to give him back to his master so he could be returned to slavery. And he was hidden in Mary Ellen Pleasant's house. Oh, here we go. Let me go down to Mary Ellen Pleasant's house. It was frequently called the House of Mystery. People claimed all kinds of things went on there. She was living with a wealthy banker from Scotland. Thomas Bell was his name. And that house burned down mysteriously in 1926. It's right up in Pacific Heights, Octavia and Bush. And right along the side of that house are about 8 eucalyptus trees. They're very old trees now. And you will see a little plaque in the sidewalk memorializing Mary Ellen Pleasant. And I was part of a committee that we worked with the city of San Francisco to have that installed so we'd have some memory of this very influential woman in San Francisco. So it's called a pocket park, probably one of the smallest parks in San Francisco, but at least it acknowledges that somebody of importance to the city lived here. So Mary Ellen Pleasant, I could talk about her for a while. She was people found her very fascinating. They didn't know the source of her power. She was technically the housekeeper for this Scottish banker at this house. She wore black. She wore what they call a Quaker bonnet. So she could kind of, I suspect that she sent people out to do things and they thought it was her, but it was just somebody else she had paid to dress like her and go and get certain things accomplished. She had a lot of things going on, but she says that she was subscribing to The Liberator, which was the newspaper of Garrison, the great abolitionist back in Massachusetts, in Boston. And that she, as an ex-slave, just felt that she had to do something more than just hide fugitives and protest in the courts. So she says that she went from California to Chatham, Ontario, because what she was planning would be considered treason to try to fight against slavery, to raise a violent uprising against slavery would be treason at best. And she met John Brown, the famous abolitionist, and she gave him $30,000 that she had collected from various people in the Black community, which was millions of dollars in today's money, and that he was to buy rifles with it. And the plan that John Brown had, I'm not sure people realize this, they were going to raid the armory at Harper's Ferry, which is right. Harper's Ferry is actually a very beautiful town. I forget the names of the rivers that come together there, I'm sorry. But they were going to incite the slaves in that area. It's now West Virginia, but in those days, it's still part of Virginia, to rise up against their masters and to start, they hoped it would catch like wildfire, a violent resistance to the slave system by the slaves themselves. And she was to ride a horse ahead of the action and tell the slaves on each plantation, your freedom is coming. At a signal, you should rise up, kill people, and form armies to march through the South and to get your freedom. Well, unfortunately, as we all know, that plan didn't go down. I don't know if it would have been fortunate if it had, but John Brown was captured, I think, the next day, and the person in charge of his capture was Robert E. Lee. We've heard of him recently. Anyway, Mary Ellen Pleasant claims that she had to go into hiding. She complained many years later that John Brown was too hot-headed, that he was too unstable. And she was very disappointed that the whole operation had not taken place. And nobody doubts that she would have done anything to bring down slavery. That her courage was never questioned. But she said in order not to be arrested, and worse, because John Brown was hanged, that she had to get herself back to California. And so she ended up back in California, and the problem with this as a historical act is that she had to keep everything completely undercover. So as historians, it's very difficult to say whether this was true or not, though a friend of mine who's a historian says that she did find her, that she bought property in Chatham, Ontario. It's in the property records and it's signed. So we can assume that she at least went there. So if an ex-slave was involved in John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry and lived to tell about it, then this would be a major rewrite of that part of history, particularly a woman acting alone. But anyway, she was known to the city of San Francisco because she financed a trial against one of the wealthiest men in the city. There were two men who owned the Palace Hotel, the most luxurious hotel in San Francisco, probably in the country at the time. William Ralston and Sharon, William Sharon. When you go into the palace, you'll see their pictures on the wall over the front desk. Well, she, one of her proteges, a woman named Sarah Althea Hill, a blue-eyed blonde, claimed that she had an affair with Senator Sharon, part owner of this hotel, and that during this affair, they had secretly married. And now she was going to sue for divorce and get half his considerable fortune. How could she afford to go up against a senator and a wealthy hotel magnate? Apparently her lawyers were paid for by Mary Ellen Pleasant. And Mary Ellen Pleasant came to court every day, and Sarah Althea Hill would come to court dressed in the latest Paris gowns and just looking fabulous. And this trial went on for about 6 months. It was like the O.J. Simpson trial of its time. Every day there was a story about this trial. It's called the Rose of Sharon case, if you ever want to look it up. It's drama that beats most soap operas. In the end, they won. But other things happened so that Sarah never really got to benefit from her victory. But I probably spent more time on Mary Ellen Pleasant, but that's because I did a lot of research on her. And she's just a fascinating person. She's buried up in Napa County in the Tula Cay Cemetery, the oldest cemetery in Napa. The African American Historical and Cultural Society buried her. And then years later, we went and secretly buried the bones of another person who loved Mary Ellen Pleasant, a poor friend of mine who couldn't afford a gravestone or anything. So we came out, one person played the cello, we sang hymns, and while this was going on, we dug a hole under the gravestone of Mary Ellen Pleasant and poured in the ashes of my friend. So I don't think the people of Tula Cay have ever known the difference. But anyway, we wanted our friend to rest next to the woman she most admired. Mary Ellen Pleasant was also responsible for, this is how she was portrayed in the paper. They wanted her to look like a witch. And, you know, this kind of way in which newspapers can often, paparazzi, make famous people look the worst they possibly can so that you begin to dislike them. Mary Ellen Pleasant was responsible for getting Black people hired to work at the palace. The palace was the original palace was 1875. It had 8 stories. It was the first hotel in the world to have stores inside the building. It had fireplaces in every room. And the thing that just blew everybody's mind, it had this new thing called flush toilets in every room. It also had what they call rising rooms. You would go in, doors would open, you'd walk in, the women would be seated, and the whole room would go up. And this we call today the elevator. And because an 8-story hotel, you're not going to want to be on any of the above 3rd floor hotel rooms if you didn't have an elevator. So this was the bee's knees. This was the swankiest hotel. It might have even beat out the Palmer House in Chicago or the Waldorf Astoria in New York. But this was San Francisco, 1875, not 20 years from the gold rush, having this level of luxury. And I recommend, if you've never been in the palace in a while, that dining room is still one of the great dining rooms in the country. 3 stories high, Austrian crystal chandeliers, all of that. But at the time it was built, it was a time in California when most jobs like this would be held by the Chinese. And Mary Ellen Pleasant thought that Black people needed a cut of the action, so she got Ralston to hire Black staff. And that was one of the better jobs that Black people could get in the city at the time. Oh, well, let me just finish by saying that this is the lobby of the original lobby on the left of the Palace Hotel. You would actually drive your carriage right in off the street into the lobby of the hotel. And the women would go to one room to kind of freshen up, and the men would go to another to smoke their cigars or whatever before you went up to your actual room. And this is the dining room on the right today. It's called the Garden Court. It really is quite something. A lot of history. Mark Twain, Ulysses S. Grant, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Fred de Lesseps, who created the Suez Canal. Warren Harding died here. So did the king of Hawaii. One of the Hawaiian kings came to California to get some health care, but died in the palace. A lot of history in this hotel. It was destroyed in the 1906 earthquake, quickly rebuilt, and what you see today is the 1909 version of this hotel. It's on the same footprint as it was originally. So that's worth visiting if you have time. Close Mary Ellen Pleasant out. One of her quotes in the newspapers of the time that I love is when people asked her why she had the nerve to do so many of the things she was reported to have done. She said, "I'd rather be a corpse than a coward." And I think that was her motto. Now to the Buffalo Soldiers. There are 400 Buffalo soldiers buried in the cemetery in the Presidio. When you go to that cemetery, where above the old barracks, the one where you can stand at the top and see the Golden Gate Bridge, it's a beautiful location. There are a lot of 30,000 people are buried there, but 400 of them are Buffalo soldiers. I got this picture, but I couldn't find who painted it. I think it's a beautiful shot. The Buffalo Soldiers were, most of us know about them. They were stationed at the Presidio here in San Francisco from the 1870s or so, right up until I think the Second World War. They were segregated units, of course. But one of the accomplishments of the Buffalo Soldiers, if you guys watched Ken Burns' The National Parks, they talked about that the Buffalo Soldiers were assigned one of their units to safeguard Yosemite against people who were trying to turn it into lumber, who were using it as sheep pastures, who were basically doing pretty much everything there except preserving it. And these soldiers were responsible for several years for preserving it. So that's their role in early American environmentalism. There's some controversy about them because they were fighting against the Native Americans, and they felt ambivalent about it. Why should we, who've been oppressed, be fighting another oppressed people? But mainly they were assigned to not wipe them out, but to round them up and put them on the reservations. Not that I'm excusing that, but they weren't asked to go out and just exterminate people. They were asked to bring them to other locations. But there are books and movies about the Buffalo Soldiers and a Bob Marley song. Let me go back to Delilah Beasley. Yeah. Delilah was responsible for us knowing a lot about what we knew about individual Black families in early California, because she would go around and interview people, and people trusted her. This is the tower of the Oakland Tribune, which you probably recognize. And her articles for the Tribune were called Activities Among Negroes. But we're very much in her debt for what we know about a lot of our early history in California. Okay, 1915. Panama Canal was being completed. New Orleans wanted to celebrate it. San Diego did and built Balboa Park. But San Francisco got the biggest celebration of all. And they basically filled in the wetlands along the bay. All of what is now the Marina District was once mud flats. And they filled it in and built this incredible, fantastic wonderland, which was called the Panama Pacific International Exposition. And the tower in the middle was, I think, about 400 feet tall and had little pieces of Austrian jewels hanging off of it so that as the sun shone on it, it would sparkle. It was called the Tower of Jewels. And at night, they would shine electricity on it and make it sparkle. And when the fog came in, people just thought it was the most magical. It was like living inside of a fairy tale or something. This was a very successful fair. It was financed basically by San Francisco itself. There were, I think, 18 million people that went through the turnstiles here. The only part of it that's still left is at the far right at the bottom. That's the Palace of Fine Arts, which is still standing. But the rest of it was quickly converted into a residential neighborhood. The buildings were all made out of burlap and plaster, not stone, not cement. San Francisco had an earthquake in 1906. This is less than 10 years later. They were not ready to haul any more stuff. So they built these buildings for the 10 months that the fair was open. And the idea was that when it was over, it would be easy to cart it away. And that's what they did. So since this was such a big event, there were all kinds of things going on here. There was a Ford Motor Factory. There was a Ghirardelli Chocolate Factory. There were lots of things. There was a building called the Mechanics Building that was so large that one of the early pilots of biplanes, a guy named Lincoln Beecher, flew his plane inside the building. And he also invented the maneuver where you're flying and it looks like you run out of gas and your plane begins to spin toward the earth. And then you cut out at the last minute, except on one of his attempts, he crashed and died. But anyway, it was quite an event. The French, the Japanese, a lot of other countries, most of the states of the Union had pavilions at this event. Okay, what do you call something like this? They had a contest. And the winner was the person who came up with the name Jewel City. And this the little girl on the left, her name is Virginia Stevens. When they found out she was colored, they canceled the parade. They were going to have a children's parade to celebrate the winner of the naming of the new festival, of the new exhibit. So they didn't have it because they couldn't stand the idea of doing this for a colored girl. Virginia Stevens' family owned a large restaurant in Oakland. Actually, they had several restaurants, which were very successful and didn't really close until the Great Depression. And Virginia went on to become the first Black woman to get a law degree from Bolt, and only the second woman to get a law degree from Bolt. So she didn't let her snubbing stop her. So this is kind of the image that went out on postcards and everything of the fair. But if you also went to what they call the amusement park, where the rides and freak shows and things like that, you saw this. This was called the Joy Zone. And so they have a large image of a Black person. This is a way that a lot of Black people were portrayed in this era. This is 1915. This is 100 years ago. This really didn't stop until after the Second World War. But this was something, if you were attending the fair, this was reinforcing your concept of Black people. They were very different. I put this in just to illustrate that even though I'm focusing on the Black community, the real energy of San Francisco dealing with race was against the Chinese. And they were extremely poorly treated. And they did not have the right to vote in the United States, no matter how many generations they've been here, until 1943 was when Chinese and people of Chinese descent could vote in the United States. And a lot of that, I believe, was due to Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who was, I think, the first woman to speak to both houses of Congress at the same time. China was our ally during the war. And she was pushing for, and the Chinese government, sort of a straw government, was pushing for Chinese Americans to get citizenship in the United States. So it happened in 1943. The whole history of the vote in America, of course, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, but the whole history of the vote is another perspective on the history of our country. This is Mrs. Josephine Cole. She was one of the people I got to interview. And she and I kind of became friends. I was always a little bit intimidated by her because she was so elegant and so well-spoken that I felt like I was in the presence of royalty. Her father was called Joe Shreve. Shreve's was the top jewelry store in downtown San Francisco. And her father was the doorman there. And that was about the most respectful job that Black men could get in those days. You know, a lot of, how you doing, ma'am? And yes, sir, and yes, ma'am. And he's mentioned Joe Shreve, which is not his name was Cole, Josephine was the nickname, and of course everybody loved him. And but his daughter became the first Black person to have a teaching job in San Francisco public schools. She taught first in an elementary school, and then that was 1941. Then about 43, somewhere in there, she went on to teach at the high school level, Balboa High School. And this was her husband, Audrey Audley. And Audley was the first Black man to be allowed to drive a cable car in San Francisco. And that was a campaign because there was a white man that stood up for him and said, I'll train him. Nobody else, none of the other whites in the union said they would train a Black man. And this white man stood up and said, I'll train him. And he was almost beaten to death by his fellow drivers. So we have, I know San Francisco seems very genteel now, but it went through a lot of some ugliness around issues of race and issues of labor. But anyway, the Coles lived in a house out on 36th Avenue. And once I went over there to interview her about something, and she had a palm tree in her living room. I'll never forget that. I'd never been in a house that was quite that, like that. It's still there. It's on Junipero Sierra at the corner of 36. It's the biggest house there. But these were Black first. Her job as the first Black classroom teacher, his job as the first Black cable car driver. Maya Angelou says she was the first female Black cable car driver. So I'm coming to the close now, but these, I just want to share with you, these were the kinds of images that the parents, grandparents, great-grandparents of today's Black communities, these were the kind of images they had to grow up with. My father saw a lot of this when he had a job where he worked in white suburbs, and frequently this was the image. This was a very popular image. Jet black, big red lips, and sort of in a subservient kind of posture. And we've heard about Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben. These were in everybody in America's kitchens as images of Black people, even in places where there were no actual Black people. This is the image that people frequently had of them. Okay, somebody's outside my window, sorry. Just wanted to bring, oh, I misspelled it. Just wanted to bring it to a close with, I'm a particular fan of architecture. This was the first Black man to get certified or to join the American Institute of Architects. I think it's called the AIA. His name was Paul Revere, not Rever, Williams. He has a young man as an older man. We're talking 20s, 30s, 40s. He designed the Beverly Hills Hotel. He designed Frank Sinatra's house. He designed quite a few Black, quite a few Hollywood celebrities' homes. He was helped design this iconic image of the LAX terminal. And this house, I'm sorry I didn't get the address, is on Divisadero near Broadway, sort of near the Mrs. Doubtfire house. This house sits in the middle of Pacific Heights. And so he was hired by influential and wealthy people, but he could not live in any of the neighborhoods for whom he designed homes. The building on the right, for those who are interested, on the corner of Divisadero on Broadway, was where Mimi Silver had her program where she was trying to rehabilitate people that were trying to get off drugs. And at one time, she had quite a few people in that situation living in that house. Pacific Heights was not happy about it at first. And then they discovered that a lot of these men had skills. They were electricians and plumbers and whatever. And when she decided to close the house, there was some consternation in the neighborhood that some of the people they had come to depend on were now going to be leaving. Anyway, I'll just mention a couple other things before we go back, before we open for questions. This was by no means a comprehensive view of everything going on in Black America, but I just wanted to get you sort of aware that we were part of the early days of this state. There was an all-Black town created in the middle of the Central Valley. It's called Allensworth. It was named for a high-ranking Black military guy, and it had a viable community. People still go there once a year. It's now a state park. And there were all Black towns in Oklahoma, Mississippi, and other places where Black people felt they were never going to get a fair shake in an integrated situation, so we had to create our own town. So that's called Allensworth. If you go over to near Russian Hill in North Beach, there's a church called the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples. And that was Howard Thurman's church. And it was started, I think, in the 50s. And it was the first intentionally racially integrated church in the Bay Area. It's still there. It's sort of non-denominational. And I guess that's it. I just want, hopefully you will appreciate and understand our state's history from a somewhat different perspective. So thanks for your time.
So at this point, if you have any questions, you can either type them in the chat and I'll read them, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask a question. Do we have any questions?
Thank you, Jesse.
Yes, thank you, Jesse. Really.
Okay, you're welcome.
Pretty stunning.
Very informative.
Yeah, I had no idea about most of this. I wrote in the chat that I went to grade school in Oakland at E. Morris Cox School on 98th and Sunnyside. My mother taught school there. And there were two big buildings and lots of children and about, I don't know, 10 or 15 portables. And in one of those portables, I recalled as an adult, that's where the Black kids were, and that's where the special needs kids were. They were segregated. They were segregated. I don't ever recall seeing them on the playground. I don't ever recall seeing them in assemblies. And when I finally, it had hit me, I was floored that it didn't faze me when I was a kid. And it didn't faze the rest of the faculty.
Yeah.
It just amazes me that I was there and part of that and really had no appreciation.
I think it's interesting, given that Kamala Harris was going to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. She also went to school in Oakland, and she had to be bused to a mostly white school, her mother felt, for her to get a decent education.
She was right.
But where I grew up in Maryland, which was segregated, yeah, most Black kids, even when integration came, they were, if you weren't in an all-Black school, you were put into special needs. It was assumed that you just weren't intellectually up to snuff, period.
Right. Mental problem.
In all fairness, I went to school in Southern California in Ventura, and it was totally integrated. And I mean, except for the disabled kids, the developmentally disabled kids were off by themselves, but it was racially integrated.
Okay. They were, if you weren't in an school, you were put into special needs. It was assumed that you just weren't intellectually up to snuff, period.
Right. Mental problem.
In all fairness, I went to school in Southern California in Ventura, and it was totally integrated. And I mean, except for the disabled kids, the developmentally disabled kids were off by themselves, but it was racially integrated.
My cousins went to school in Marin County and in Oregon, and they never had any problems. This was the 80s, maybe.
In all fairness, I went to school in Southern California in Ventura.
I don't know why this keeps repeating.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. If you're not talking, if you could just mute yourself, that will help a lot to keep the background noise down.
Okay.
We do have one other question that was asked, Jesse. Can you tell us a little bit about Black Cowboys in California?
No. I know that they have an association. They have a website. I know that they have a tiny museum, I've been told, down in kind of near Gilroy, somewhere down in there. And I know they have Black Rodeo. That's all I know. I don't know anything about the history except that 1 out of every 5 cowboys in the Old West was black. Now, how many black cowboys did you see on your Western? I mean, so please don't depend on Hollywood for your history. That was not, and the Chinese, unfortunately, in the wagon trains were generally just the cooks. If the blacks were also frequently cooks as well as cowboys.
In Oakland, we have the Black Cowboy Parade. We also have a Black Cowboy Association. If you go, I think you can still go on their website and learn quite a bit about the Black Cowboys. One of the other things is that the Chinese and the Chinese merchants and the black communities work very well together, because the blacks needed to get food and merchandise, and the Chinese would loan that to them. And then so when they got paid, they paid it off. I know my uncle, who had a grocery store out in San Francisco, the first and second, usually between the first and the fifth, he would have all this money. And I asked him what, and he had a logbook. And we had a lot of black families, of course, Chinese families, and some whites that would come into the grocery store. And that's what they did. So if you look at the history of Chinatown and especially down south, there was a lot of this mutual business going on. And then, of course, with the Exclusion Act from the Chinese, the blacks ended up helping the Chinese get established also. So it's quite a history in America, and it's nothing. I tell people it's nothing to be ashamed of. And to quote the president, "It is what it is," or "It is what it was," but we've come out of it. And people of color have a tendency to help people, all types of people, irregardless. So that's my view on it.
All right. Well, I think we lost.
Oh.
Go ahead, Fran.
I was just going to say to Kathy, my daughter attended kindergarten at E. Morris Cox School, and my first teaching job was up the hill at Toller Heights School. And in 1967, when we were looking into purchasing a home off Grass Valley Road, the realtor showed us a statement that it was for whites and Orientals only. And that was 1967 in Oakland.
All right. Well, I think we're about out of time, and I don't see Jesse. I think he may have clicked a wrong button or something. So I want to thank everyone for attending. I just want to let you know our next discussion around this topic will be on Saturday, August 22nd at 11 a.m. We'll be doing a short film called Triangle of Hope, and I hope you'll join us. And other than that, thank you for attending and have a fabulous night.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, John. Thank
you,
Jess
Joe.
for us when he gets back on, if he does.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jess. Thank everybody.
Yeah.
Jesse.
Really good.
Thank you.
Really learned so much. Thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Great.
Bye, thanks.
Great to see everybody.
Nice to see you, Cheryl.
What time is the event on the 22nd of August?
Sorry, that was Jesse on the phone telling me his battery died on what happened. It's 11 a.m.
And you'll send a email with the link?
Yeah, it's in the Friday e-blast.
One coming up.
Yeah, and it was even in last Friday's too. So but yeah, it'll be in the one coming up as well.
Thanks, John.
All right, no problem. Have a good night.
Night.